Well, good morning, everybody. It's time for Rowing Chat again at the end of the month. I'm always looking forward to these days. The preparation's done, and we're sitting here in the studio with our guest this month, who is Gordon Hamilton. Gordon, hello, and thank you for joining us.
Hello, Rebecca. Thank you for asking me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, Gordon. How come you came to be a rowing coach?
That's an interesting question. Actually, when I was in college and then rowing there, I never understood what the coaches wanted me to do. And I just kept thinking, actually, there must be a better way to express this, because it was sure beyond me. And so I started off just really trying to think about what is it they want and how is it they can't communicate it. And I just kept thinking about that, and that has motivated me ever since, I first started to really row seriously, is think about a better way to express what the coaches want.
And so you've obviously done a lot of coaching. Run me through your track record. My first coach, I was a student at Cambridge University, and obviously you get roped into coaching all kinds of boats there. When I left Cambridge, my first coaching job was at a private high school where I began the girls' high school program, and at the end of that year, first year, they won the national championships. I moved on from there to the University of Virginia women's team, and from there to Williams College women's team, and from there I went to Brazil, where I coached, trained some small boats for their Olympic trials. After that, I went back to the States, where I worked in a national training center, did some national team coaching at the World Championships, etc. Became the freshman coach at MIT. Mm-hmm. Then, when Bruce Bell, the varsity coach, moved on to Cal, I became the varsity coach at MIT, where I stayed for 22 years. Left there, sort of retired, quote unquote, and have been coaching at the Florida Rowing Center since around 2006. In between all that time, I was doing private coaching and sculling here and there. Fantastic.
Cambridge Boat Club then.
That's fantastic track record. Funnily enough, I learned to row at Cambridge University in a men's college that were going mixed, and the men were terribly keen to teach the girls how to row.
Yeah, that's it.
So, kicking into some of the great questions that the readers and listeners have sent in, as a coach, what is the very first thing you teach a new rower, and how do you that?
The very first thing is the simple blade work. Getting the blade squared up and into the water squared, and then out squared, not feathering underwater. I don't pay much attention initially to how they feather, because that really requires the development of muscles that are just not developed, and it's just a lot of minutia that's beyond what they need to know. Although it's vital, but just getting the blade in, getting it out, and I'll practice with them either simply holding the boat at the dock, the wide trainer, and have them just row with one oar at a time, and then once they get competent in that feeling of the blade clicked into square and coming out squared and then feathering, then we teach them how to back. Because, one, it's actually quite simple, and it gives them a lot of confidence that they can maneuver the boat, and it's about the most important skill to have for safety. So that's our basic novice rower.
That sounds very effective. Now, going on with another question about novices, how do you make novices realise that balance and timing are more effective in a rowing boat than brute force?
Well, you put them in a sculling boat, and it becomes pretty apparent that they've got to learn what to do.
And then we start working on, or I start working on their structure, their form, their core, how to hold themselves in the boat and connect to the boat in a really sort of neurological, physical way. And they just realize very quickly that brute force doesn't work, that they have to really learn how to connect to the boat. And stability is really, it happens to be one of my big points in teaching stability and how to get the oars off the water, which is a lot easier than it's made out to be.
Go on, give us the inside track.
On getting your oars off the water?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Well, how do you teach it?
Well, ideally, I go through a very hands-on, on-land manipulation of the person's body, really. Have them sit up, I put my hands under their elbows, I put their elbows in the proper position that I want. Stability of the shoulder girdle, working from that. Core stability, working from the major back muscles, drawing down through their elbows into my palms so I can feel what their structure is. My elbows would represent the riggers and pins, and I can feel where they're pushing and what they're doing, and then I move them through the recovery and paying attention to all the movements. That's how I do it over and over and over again, so that they realize how their structure is vitally important, that they start to feel themselves as a piece of the equipment, not as some sort of alien that's been dropped down on a...
So that's all on the land?
Yep. And then you put them in the boat and work on their structure after we've gone over the basic blade work.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah, that's it.
You say that's it. Come on, let's have a little bit more.
All right. There are a number of sort of building blocks which we work on, and the first one comes straight from our friend Steve Fairburn, and that is always applying pressure against the pins in the direction that the blade is moving, and starts out on the land exercise, and I can feel where their pressure is, and it comes through the elbows, not through the thumbs, and move. Always it's a vector into the blade, and that goes on. That gives them a sense of stability right away when they get this idea of always pushing into the blade, that the boat is not an ergometer, it's not a two-dimensional thing. You're always working in that 3 dimensions and working into the blade and keeping the boat as wide as you can. And when you do that, the boat, whatever it is, a recreational boat or even a racing single, it becomes as stable as my launch, as long as you make symmetrical patterns.
Do you start athletes in fine boats, or do you have learn to row flat bottom boats?
No, we have learned to row boats, yeah. And in fact, I keep recommending that people go back into those boats. I think that ideally, if people are learning proper technique, once you learn how to make a boat stable, it doesn't matter whether it's wide or narrow, because the principles are the same. The issues with your recreational flat bottom boats are that they let you get away with bad rowing. And if you hold yourself to the standard of keeping your riggers still and yourself stable, and I think, you could sum it up that if you're not stable, that's what we really work on. You, the person himself, herself, is not stable, then you're not stable. I mean, it's really that. So we approach it from that angle.
So moving on from those really solid beginnings into the more finesse of the power phase of the stroke and the recovery phase of the rowing stroke, how do you prevent excessive speed on the recovery?
Well, that comes very much from this idea of always applying pressure against the pin, and learning how to go from the release to the entry without drawing yourself with your feet. You can actually go from the release to the entry on the recovery by this method of applying pressure against the pin as you separate your handles, as though imagining you were on a big skateboard, for example. in pocket doors. And when you're connected to the pin, then you are going to be moving with the boat, as opposed to this sort of dismembered almost person in a boat drawing the shell under you, as we're all taught to do with our feet. And then at the same time, you're moving your upper body towards the stern, but you're pulling your feet towards the bow. It's all very complicated, and your weight gets divided between the upper body and the lower body, and I just think it creates problems. If you put yourself on the pin and you make the recovery 100% from the upper body, separating the handles as though you're on that skateboard, you will find that you're not excessively rushing up the slide.
Yeah.
But I think that you're striving for a feeling of neutrality, not pulling anywhere or going anywhere, but just you keeping your weight on the pins, on the riggers, above the hands, and separating the hands. That will move you into the stern.
It certainly will. Moving on to a next question that's come from a very interesting point of view. One of our listeners is an older gentleman who was a sweep rower for many, many years and has now moved to sculling. And he describes himself as an aged novice sculler. He says, what exercises can you propose for an aged novice sculler? I have difficulties with getting blades off the water and getting any length at the catch.
Okay. First of all, it comes down to your structural posture. Honestly, you're not going to ever get your blades off the water because, as I said, if you're not stable, you're not stable. So you need to learn how to make yourself stable. Then length, you want to distinguish between length and reach. The reach is early body preparation, the arms straightening first, then the body preparation with the knees held down. Then you let the knees come up, and if you draw yourself through those pocket doors, you will get the length that your flexibility allows. Bringing the knees up too soon really inhibits your ability to get length. So I think there are drills. There's a great drill I call the skimming drill, where you can sit with your blades flat on the water, you extend the arms, rock your body over, and then simply draw yourself as though you're on that skateboard by separating the handles and pushing into the blade. Draw yourself up the slide, and if you're drawing down from your armpits, your boat is stable. Another one that's really important for people who are beginning, or all the time. I mean, no drills are ever in your pocket and you have control over. That you can just say that's done. Is sitting at the release and just hinging from the forearms, releasing the blade from the water over and over and over again, and then following through without any body movement, just the arms straightening and keeping the blades off the water. If you keep your pressure on the pins, you will be able to do that. But the key is, as the arms extend, obviously the elbows come in towards each other, and that's where people lose the pins and they lose their stability and go into free fall.
Very, very nice explanation. I do hope that your elderly novice sculler is listening.
Yeah, and one of the things, as I gave a couple of drills there, I call the release tapping out the king of the mountain. And it's important, I think, we have a coach here who has an expression, a saying that if you're a fox and you want to catch a rabbit, don't go after two rabbits. Just focus on one rabbit at a time, or you won't get anything. You won't catch any. And I think that's an important thing when you're doing a drill. Know what you're trying to accomplish and just focus on that.
So moving on then to thinking about a single scull, what are your top key things for moving a single quickly?
Okay, that sums up a lot. I think that one of the things that you have to understand, and it seems very basic, but not really considered by a lot of people, is that you are a relatively big person on a little boat on water, and that every movement that you make, every movement, there isn't one that doesn't have an impact on how the boat moves. And sometimes they are directly related to the movement of the boat, and sometimes they're related to damage control. But in either case, every single movement, you can't mention one that you shouldn't practice, and that means do drills. And some of them are very, very subtle. For example, just dropping your elbows at the back end of the drive. There's a pretty basic rule. If your elbows drop, your weight drops. And one of the things that you really want to be concerned about is preservation of momentum through control of your weight, and that's largely at the two transition points. At the entry, falling on your feet will kill the run of the boat, and at the release, falling on the seat into the bow. Anytime you leave the riggers, your weight leaves the riggers, you need to be very careful, and you need to pay complete attention, absolute attention to what you're doing. 100% of the time on the recovery, you want to be on the riggers, and that includes through the entry, the arrival of the blade into the water. You stay on the riggers. I think keeping off the feet is such a big thing, and it's so hard to learn. Where else is your weight going to be? If it's not on the seat and the feet, it's got to be on the riggers. So I think that it's a little bit different. I don't put an awful lot of emphasis on the drive. I think that if you get the blade in the water while you're on the recovery, which happens to be possible to do actually if you make the recovery by drawing through the pocket doors, then the process of putting the blade in the water is the same process that got you to the entry. If you do that, you can, the drive will take care of itself. If you will have enough poise to allow the blade to get loaded and set before the drive. Very difficult, but possible to be on the recovery when the blade goes in the water if you practice this method. But where I really put my focus is on the recovery. As we're all sort of told, you want to unweight the recovery, the drive. We want to unweight the recovery too, because when your weight is on the riggers, it's distributed throughout the whole boat from the bow to the stern. It's one of the things that the structure of the boat does when your weight is out there. It's not on the seat, it's not on the feet, it's not on the port side, it's not on the starboard side. It's distributed throughout the whole boat. And it requires structure in order to do that, and the right vectors into the pin. There's a word that every coach uses, which I think is about the worst thing that you can possibly say to somebody, and that is relax. Because that isn't in the first place what the coach intends. The coach sort of means release tension, but when they say relax, what people hear is, beanbag. I'm watching television, I'm on the sofa, and you can never lose your structure. You always have to keep the structure, and so that's number one. And you need to realize, as I've said, every single move matters. There are a couple of basic building blocks. I've already alluded to all of them, in fact: pressure into the pin and structural posture. And the structural posture is so important, and often it's just expressed as sit up, but it's a lot more precise than that. It requires, number one, keeping your lumbar spine drawn into your navel all the time, 100% of the time, and not just when you're in a boat, by the way, when you're walking around or whatever you're doing. That is so important for your structure and your chest up. Those two things right there will in fact put you on the seat in the proper position. We talk about sitting on your sits bones, but nobody ever explains why you should be sitting on your sits bones. Well, the fact is that if your lumbar is drawn into your spine and your chest is up, you will be sitting on your sits bones in the proper posture. So just sitting on your sits bones doesn't really address the issue. The next thing that you have to do for your structural posture is draw down from your armpits onto the riggers, so that you're creating yourself as a sort of cylinder. There are no loose nuts and bolts, and all the connection comes from that drawing down from your armpits or your major back muscles onto the riggers and the lumbar spine tucked in. As I say, no loose nuts and bolts. So that, in effect, you know, another thing that we're told that I think is really harmful to rowing is this idea of hanging from your lats. It creates this sort of dismembered object in a boat with an upper body and a lower body, and you're hanging, and you want to suspend your weight, but you must move through your lower back, through the lumbar spine. And then another part of our structural posture that's really vital is, I believe, the elbows need to stay in front of your body. And a lot of very good, very, very good and successful coaches tell you to drive the elbows through the body. And you ask them why, and they'll say, well, it's very powerful. And you want to accelerate the boat into the finish. And now, it is very powerful, and it's exactly what you would do if you wanted to rip a stump out of the ground. Or, we've been in New England anyway, they've been through a long winter, and snow blowers, if you had an old-fashioned one that didn't have an electric starter, you would pull it and rip your elbows through your body. And that's all very powerful, but the problem is you end up in a very weak position. When your elbows pass your body, your shoulder girdle loses stability, and you can't hold your weight up anymore, and it's going to go down onto the seat. And you can just see the difference now, especially with all the beautiful video technology we have, you can see the boat respond to the elbows passing through the body and the instability in the shoulder girdle and the weight dropping and the bow of the boat dropping. So that's another point, a very key point. You keep the elbows in front of the body, and you have to be very sort of insisting upon how you move the boat. You move the boat with your legs and your body swing. And the function of the arms, significant enough, but it isn't to make the boat go faster per se. It's to sustain your suspension in the back half of the drive and execute the release and transition into the recovery. That's the function of the arms, which is enough, certainly, but it isn't to try to accelerate the boat into the finish, which you just have to look at a velocity curve of one stroke, and you'll see a boat does not accelerate all the way into the release. It starts to slow down. And I think this is a big mistake on people's part. Any effort to try to make that boat go faster in the last, say, quarter of the drive, eighth of the drive, is a mistake, because it will not go faster, and you will just rip the oars through the water. You will start working against the water rather than with the water, and the whole system starts to fall apart, and you go into free fall because you're no longer suspended anywhere, you're falling.
Very interesting. So, Gordon, you've used a phrase a couple of times which I think I would like to hear an explanation of, and the words are the pocket doors. What is a pocket door?
Okay. They're doors in which the doors themselves recede into the frame. Because if it were just a door frame, you couldn't move. And this sort of relates to the image of that people tell you to put your blade behind a post and imagine yourself levering yourself past the post. Well, if you're sculling and there are two posts and you put your blades behind those posts, you're not going to move. The oar handles will not move. Nothing will move. So that's why they're pocket doors. They must recede into the frame of the doorway.
Understood. That's really clear. Now, drills are something that many coaches use as part of their teaching method. How are drills best applied?
I think that drills, rowers need to do drills. Everybody wants to get faster, and they want to get better, and they only have a certain amount of time for their rowing. Well, some people just go out and enjoy the rowing. But if you want to get better, you must break the stroke down into component parts. As I've said, every single movement has a purpose, either directly related to the speed of the boat or damage control. And the only way to perfect those movements, and you can perfect them, is by isolating them and doing a particular drill. And some of them are very, very subtle. And you have to, as I say, you need to chase just one rabbit. So I'm focusing on the release, and there is a drill for the release. You do it, and you do it, and you do it. But when you do a drill, I think it's best to keep the number of repetitions to a small number. For example, like 5, if you're doing, let's say, a half slide pause drill. You'd have a particular goal in mind that you're trying to accomplish. So you would do 5 strokes with that half slide pause, and at each one you'd evaluate how you did it, whether it's whatever it is, where's your weight, or did the hands leave nested, or were they stacked, or did the elbows drop, any number of issues that you can have. So you keep your mind focused exactly on what you're trying to achieve, and then maybe do 5 strokes imagining you're doing the drill, right? So if it's a half slide pause with the arms away, or just pausing with the arms away, you'd pause, then you would do 5 strokes imagining a pause there, and coming up and continuing into the stroke, and then you do something like 5 strokes with the whole picture in mind. And I think that you need to constantly keep relating the drill to the big picture, because sometimes people, they just get very good at doing drills, and then when it comes to actually applying it to the full stroke, it's a mess again. And a really good example of this I see all the time is square blade rowing. You can see people rowing with square blades beautifully, you know, and then as soon as they have to feather, it's back to the same problem, because the square blade release is only half the issue. The square blade and the feather go really hand in hand. Those are 2 maneuvers that must be coordinated carefully, and so just doing square blade rowing doesn't address the real issue. So in something like square blade rowing, do 2 strokes square blade rowing, and then 2 strokes feathered, and keep repeating back and forth, because it needs to be related to the overall stroke.
That's very, very clear. Now, how does technique change when you're moving from rowing a single scull to a double scull?
Well, of course, the speed is a little bit different. But as far as the technique goes, it's certainly on the recovery, there is no change. And the recovery, again, it gets very little attention. And on the drive, I think a double, more than any boat, is the compromise boat. I don't think it works when somebody just sits in the stroke seat, for example, and says, my way or the highway, or my way or the river, or whatever. So I think that you need to practice that blending, because it has to be a compromise. People have different skills, and you want to take advantage of those skills and sort of find a meeting of the bodies, as it were. There's a really good drill for that. You could row, for example, have just the stroke row while the bow is just sitting in the bow and moving and feeling the movement of the stroke. Who's rowing at full pressure would row maybe 5 to 10 strokes with a pause somewhere. And the pause you just throw in to let the boat slow down, and so you can regather and think about what's going on. So you would do 5 to 10 strokes the stroke with a pause, and then 5 to 10 strokes without a pause. All the time the bow is just sitting there feeling mostly the drive, because there's no change in the technique of the recovery. That stays the same. It's the drive that's going to be different. And then you switch off. The bow would do 5 to 10 strokes with a pause while the stroke is trying to feel how the boat feels.
and then the bow would do 5 to 10 without a pause, and then the stroke would join in, 5 to 10 with a pause and then without. And you do this back and forth 5, 6, 7 times, and it develops into a very different stroke and becomes very powerful.
Very clear answer, and a great thing for that questioner to practice. Now, one of the questions has clearly come from somebody who has been coached by you, because they say, I remember you teaching a fairly upright finish position. What's the benefit of this?
Well, I think there's confusion about, because we stress so much the keeping the elbows in front of the body. By the way, the importance of that is it stabilizes the shoulder girdle. It positions the shoulder so that it's structural rather than small muscles, which can hold your weight above your hands. And I think that it's not an upright position. I'm not sure what she means. There are people that I've coached who do not get a lot of body swing, and that's a mistake. But I think that if they haven't been coached very long, they take the elbows forward, shoulder girdle